Hello, beautiful humans. Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm your host. I'm happy to be here, and I'm so happy that you are listening. Thanks for being here and being a part of this wonderful community of reclaimers. I am so excited about this topic that I want to talk about with you all today. The title of the episode is called Therapy Speak and What Happens in Psychotherapy. And the reason why I wanted to record this episode is because it's really alive in our culture right now, this idea of therapy speak. And so I thought I would kind of add my hat into the ring with some of my own thoughts about what this means and what this phenomenon is all about, and kind of help us navigate what purpose therapy speak may be serving in our own lives. Because if you're listening to this episode, then chances are you probably listen to a lot of podcasts about self-help, self-development, bettering the self, healing, empowerment. Gosh, right? Like if you listen to this podcast, if you follow me on Instagram, then you're probably following a bunch of other people who share educational content on what it means to navigate interpersonal dynamics. You know, I write a lot about the worthiness wound, but I'm certainly not the only person writing about it. And I think that means that this idea of therapy speak is probably going to resonate with you, because it's probably something that most people that are listening to the podcast are guilty of. And I know I'm guilty of it. I'm certainly not speaking as if I'm from this pedestal. Like this is I think all of our grapplings. And so I thought I would have a conversation with you about it, and talk about what it means. But before I get into the episode, a couple of things. One, I got such amazing feedback on my previous podcast episode with Meredith Redding on borderline. It was such a privilege and honor having her on as a guest, and I really appreciate every single one of you who have emailed me, have sent me private messages, and have told me personally how much that episode resonated with you. If you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. Speaking of therapy speak, the idea of borderline is certainly part of pop culture. It's a language that we use, and often it is used incorrectly, and often it's used to weaponize and pathologize. And I wanted to record an episode to break down how we can actually use that word to deepen our relationship with ourselves. And Meredith Redding is just an incredible guest speaker. She's a wonderful mentor and friend, and I really, really love her presence in the world. So go check out that episode. I put it in the show notes. But second quick thing, I am currently accepting new patients in my private practice. I work with both individuals and couples. If you are a longtime listener of the podcast, or any episode that I have shared resonates with you in terms of my approach, my philosophy, my thoughts, then maybe working together may be a good fit. You can learn more by going to thaissky.com/therapy. I will also put that in the show notes. And if you're interested in couples therapy, you can go to thaissky.com/couples, so you can learn more about what working together looks like, and if we may be a good fit for each other. Okay, so I want to talk about therapy speak in light of something that has happened recently, some text messages that got shared on the internet by either an ex or a current girlfriend of Jonah Hill's, and that has really sparked a kind of cultural conversation around this idea of therapy speak. There was an article in the New York Times, The Guardian, there was an article in Vanity Fair with Esther Perel where she said that therapy speak is making us lonelier. There's been many conversations and many people who are interested in what is this idea of therapy speak, why is it on the rise right now, and what can we do about it, how is it useful and how is it not. And while I agree that there's certain words that I have seen to continually be increasingly used, words like triggered and boundaries, kind of these pop psych words that kind of mean stuff that people write about but also can mean nothing. I'm not convinced that this is a new phenomenon, and I'm not also convinced that this is only happening or only has happened in the world of psychotherapy or psychology. my background, I come from the wellness world. I come from the yoga world. I come from the spiritual world. There have been many kind of pockets of communities that I've been a part of over the decade or more that I've been on this journey of betterment, so to speak. And in every community that I have found myself in, this phenomenon exists, which is that we use words. We use words to describe certain conditions, certain experiences, certain phenomenons that have utility. But then the word gets used so often that it starts to lose its sanctity, its integrity, and starts to mean a whole bunch of other things. The word that I'm thinking of right now is this idea of gaslighting. My understanding is that it originates from a play. Somebody grabbed this idea from this play, started to write about it, and now it's everywhere. And everyone is talking about, are you gaslighting me? You're gaslighting me, to mean everything and anything. And used in many ways quite inappropriately, like it's not what's actually happening. But we like words to describe meanings of things because, of course we do. We are language beings, and language captures certain feelings and certain experiences. And when we can use a word that captures a feeling, my goodness, does that clarify something for us? I've seen... I'm watching Love is Blind Brazil. I am Brazilian. I was born in Brazil, but I've lived in the United States since I was a child, and it's really interesting watching Love is Blind Brazil and Love is Blind here in the United States, and how the couples kind of find each other and express each other. And one of the things that is true of the Brazilian culture is that there's more language to describe different levels of passion and love and connection than there are in English. And so, every time on the show somebody says, "Estou apaixonada por você," the translation of it, the subtitles is, "I'm in love with you." But to be apaixonada is not to be in love. It's a slightly subtler, different form of love than what it is meant in the English language, in the English culture. And I've been so struck by that, how when we add more words to our language, we are essentially adding more internal experiences that can be named and understood. If there is a language that has 15 different words for the color blue, in that they are going to inherently see more different variations of blue than a culture that only has one word to describe blue. The more words we have to describe different feel states, the more those feel states become accessible and available to us. You see this in different cultures that have different values, different emphasis and things. You can see how it changes how that person is experienced and related to in that culture. It's really cool. Language is so cool. So on the one hand, using like these words like triggered, trauma dumping, even the word trauma, can give us so much deeper, nuanced understanding of ourselves. To know that something was traumatic versus just a painful experience can elucidate the vast amount of pain that we've been in. It can give us a gravity of an internal experience that allows us to then really grapple with the consequences of that, the thing that happened to us. Language is important. Language is meaningful. We know ourselves because of language and because of how language has been used with us. This is what sets us really apart from so many other forms of life on this planet, is that we have this really intricate form of language. And part of the art of kind of talk therapy is this idea that our internal experience is not separate from language. And the more that we bring language to what's happening inside, the more it can be understood, it can be digested, it can be integrated, it can be known. And when we know more of ourselves, we know more of, we feel more spacious, we feel more whole. Talk therapy, talking is not just like, oh, I'm just gonna just say a lot of words and it's not gonna mean anything. When we talk, we feel. When we talk, we experience. When we talk, we know. And so language is really, really important in that. However, what we So, see, on the other hand, on the flip side, this idea of therapy speak is, I think, being captured in that word or those words, this idea that there are then words that can be used in some ways to appear really knowledgeable and intelligent, and it can elicit a sense of authority, it can elicit a sense of superiority, of expertise, but it also creates a massive amount of distance between us and the other, or between even within ourselves. So I remember when I started clinical training to become a psychotherapist, and the world of psychotherapy has its own unique language, right? Clinicians, practitioners use a very specific set of language to try to understand the human that's in front of us. And sometimes, like I'm saying, those categories and that language can be really, really useful. The DSM, I know we've talked about this with Meredith a couple times, but the DSM is really attempting to capture different phenomenons, different kind of criterias and experiences of the human condition in a way that can be contained. Like if you're experiencing these set of symptoms, maybe this is what's going on for you. Actually, it's not like, that's not what it is. There's these set of symptoms, and we're going to categorize them and put a label on it. And maybe by putting a label on these category of symptoms, we can then feel a little bit more contained. The challenge that I found, though, when I walked into clinical training and saw all these people who have been in practice for a very long time use these clinical words, it really felt like they were categorizing people as if people are far away from themselves. And this, again, is kind of connected to the conversation I had with Meredith about borderline. Borderline is a great example of this, where it's so easy to be like, oh, that patient is borderline, to imply that that patient and that clinician are very far away from each other, when in reality we are much closer to each other than we sometimes even care to admit. What makes a really good therapist, makes a good healer, a good practitioner, is someone who is able to be in touch with more aspects of themselves. So they're not treating an other that is in front of them, but treating a human. And that is two different things. And I was really alarmed when I saw and continue to see practitioners use labels and words to create this distance as if the person is an other that is then pathologized and have to be treated almost in a dehumanizing way. And that made me really scared of the field. Luckily, I have since found some really wonderful practitioners and wonderful humans who don't speak that way and don't see it that way. And you'll find that it is the people who don't speak that way are also the better practitioners, because they know that these experiences that they're seeing in their patient is not very far away from an experience that they've had. We can be different, and we are different, and it's important as practitioners, clinicians, healers, to see our patients and clients as an other, as a different person. But when I say other, I'm talking about in a way that is like, I am not at all like them. Like they are a bad other. Like I and them are not on the same plane. There's a way in which we use language to elicit a superiority as I know better than you. And that can be really, really painful, because if you are the end of that language, if somebody talks to you that way, you can also often feel very infantilized, misunderstood, distanced, shamed. And you may feel like unless you speak the right language, you're never going to be understood, and yet you don't know what language to use. And so it's just like a really painful experience. Okay, let me look at my notes here. So I see therapy speak being used in its iteration, its unique version in every field that I've ever existed in. I see this a lot in the spiritual community. In fact, I just saw an Instagram reel where someone was talking about transcending the 3D. moving into 5D and the quantum leaps required and the shedding that exists and how the energy just falls away around you when you are quantum leaping into the 5D, and that it's important that you make yourself available and open for the things to fall away in order for the 5D vibrational energy things to kind of come to you, and it will be attracted to you as you quantum leap up into a higher vibration. And I repeated it back to you. If I had said it as if it were my words, maybe it would elicit some sort of authority to you. Maybe you would feel like, wow, Thaís really knows what she's talking about there. I just said a bunch of words. Honestly, I have no idea what any of it means. And you could just explain it to me, I'm sure. Somebody could tell me what the difference is between 3D and 5D and the quantum leap and what does that mean. These are all unique language to a unique set of individuals in a community. And I understand, again, that language has meaning and power. But when I listened to that person speak, all the sense I got is that she doesn't know what she's talking about either. Because what you tend to find is people that know what they're talking about can use very simple language. And it's people that feel like they have to hide behind the jargon and the cliches and the fancy words. They're the people who don't know what they're talking about. And that's okay. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes I repeat things or say things that I don't quite fully understand and know. I'm not saying this to say like it's something so far away from my experience. There's been plenty of podcast episodes where I've said things I'm not, and taught concepts or shared ideas that I'm still not quite understanding. There are some podcast episodes I listen back to and I'm like, oh, I think I got that wrong. I think I missed something. I didn't quite get that right. This happens. This is humanity. This is the human experience. But we want to be conscientious of when this is happening for us in our interpersonal relationships, because often when we're using jargon-filled words and we're using a lot of words, we're trying to communicate something to the other person. And I'll get to that in a minute. I completely agree with Esther Perel's take that using this type of language, using therapy speak, can really serve to deepen our sense of loneliness. Because if you think about therapy speak as a filler, as a bubble, as a way to appear more superior or more knowledgeable than we are, then we're putting forward a mask. We're putting forward a false self. And so of course then we're going to feel deeply lonely and alone because we're not really revealing much of who we are. This language is not often very vulnerable. And of course then we're going to feel misunderstood or not seen, despite the fact that sometimes we use these words because we very much want to be seen in something. But we're gonna continue to rub up against this challenge. Is we're gonna use these words hoping that it means that we can bypass the explanation or the emotional intimacy or the vulnerability required to be seen, hoping that the other person just understands us and just gets what we mean and then can just attune to us. But the more of these kind of filler big words like triggered, whenever we use that word, the other person may not know what we mean. And so we're going to ultimately feel resentful and afraid and, like even more far away from the person. It defeats the purpose. So instead of saying something like, hey, you've really triggered me, which could mean anything and nothing, like what does triggered even really mean? You could say something like, hey, I feel really scared. The difference is astronomical. Triggered could mean anything. What did I trigger? I triggered what in you, right? Whereas if you're going straight to I feel really scared, when you say that, now we're talking in a more honest and open way. So I think that therapy speak is just another way. It's just now we're using it in terms of psychology, but it's just another way that we're creating distance and we're pushing something away. And the more jargon-filled and cliche-filled somebody's speaking is, the more they're probably, maybe in some ways, not wanting to be emotionally vulnerable, not knowing that they're not being emotionally vulnerable, right? They may be distant from you, but they may also be distant from themselves. And this leads into kind of like the next part of this conversation, which is, but wait a minute, isn't that what you do in therapy, is learn how to therapy speak? And I can understand that could be a common misunderstanding if we've never been in therapy, is to think that to be in therapy means to kind of learn these words and learn what they mean. in the world of psychotherapy, we call this psychoeducation, and I don't understand why we have to add the psycho in front of it, because it's just educating. And education can play a role in helping us understand ourselves, certainly, but that's not really what good psychotherapy is. It's not about learning the words. It's not about talking the walk, right? Because that's essentially what we're doing. We're hoping that if we learn the words, we don't have to walk the walk. We can just talk the walk. I can just say I'm triggered, and then I don't actually have to get into the emotional, vulnerable, and the hard work of showing myself, showing you to myself, showing me to you. So psychotherapy is not about talking the walk. It's about talking the talk, right? It's about learning how to walk the walk by talking, by exploring our inner worlds, by bringing language to what's going on internally, instead of by acting it out, instead of by falling into patterns over and over and over again, instead of avoiding or getting so flooded, so overwhelmed, so discombobulated by emotions. You know, psychotherapy is an opportunity for us to kind of learn how to contain and hold and understand and process and explore what's happening inside of us. It's about talking what is happening, and the more that we bring language to what is happening, or giving our, being given or being supported to develop a language for what's happening inside of us, more of ourselves become available to us. It's really, really cool. Going back to this idea that if you have 15 different words for the color blue, then you're going to see more blue. If you kind of get support in expanding the vocabulary of what may be happening internally, well, more of what's happening internally will make sense to us, will be available and open to us. Here's another example that I often see in my clinical work and also have experienced in my personal life. We're going to talk about eating disorders for a minute, and this idea of I feel fat, because feeling fat is a very common set of language, set of words that people that are grappling with disordered eating disorder, body dysmorphia, come in expressing. I feel fat. I ate that and I felt fat. He said that and I felt fat, right? Like I looked in the mirror and I felt fat. Feeling fat is not a feeling, but it's trying to capture something. These words, feeling fat, is trying to capture an internal experience. It's like the color blue. Feeling fat is having one word for the color blue. So all these complicated emotions of what may have happened when you looked in the mirror, or when that person said that thing, or when you ate that thing, the shame, the guilt, the complexity within the word shame, or what that word guilt even means to you, all that gets erased because we only have the words feeling fat. In psychotherapy, what we're doing is we're giving you more words, essentially. We're helping you explore the nuanced texture of your internal world by helping you bring more words to what may have happened in that moment, what may be happening to you when you're saying, I feel fat. Suddenly, it's not just one word for the color blue. Now you have expanded your vocabulary. You have 15 different words for the color blue. Now it's not feeling fat. Now it's I'm distressed. Now it's I'm feeling anguish. Now it's I'm feeling a deep rejection. Now it's I felt in that moment when I ate that thing like I felt when I was 12 years old, 2 years old, and this thing happened, this type of hopelessness that nobody was ever going to be able to love me for who I am, right? It just like suddenly you have more colors, suddenly you have more words. That's what happens in psychotherapy. Not learning the word triggered, not learning the word boundaries. Boundaries is such a popular topic, and I think it's really, really interesting. It's a Western phenomenon, this idea of boundaries, and the ways in which we really try to bypass a lot of complex relational dynamics by just imposing these rules that people are just supposed to know. And if they violate, you have then this permission slip to be resentful and angry with them. Boundaries can mean so many different things to different people, different cultures, different relationships, but it can get lumped into just this one idea boundaries. And if you are good and if you don't people please anymore, it means that you're bounded. And it's so lacking nuance. Going into therapy isn't about learning these words. It's not just about opening a book and getting these words kind of given to you, but rather it's about finding our own words. It's about finding words that matches what's happening inside of us. I personally, in my work as a psychotherapist, I avoid jargon. I really try, and of course, sometimes, like I said, language matters, language is important, and sometimes the word that we're looking for is the word triggered or is the word boundaries, and then we get to explore it and think about it and talk about it. But I try to avoid jargon because oftentimes we have different definitions for what these words mean. So what I'm really looking for and what I'm really facilitating with my clients is an emotional honesty that really comes from as plain of language as possible. Just to be clear though, I'm not talking about that you can't use fancy words, if you have an expanded vocabulary, but by all means, right? But I'm simply saying plain language as jargon-free as possible, as simple as close to an emotional, vulnerable space as possible. There's no bypassing, deep psychological work and psychoeducation, learning the right words, or learning what words mean. It's a small part of that. But if we lean too much on psychoeducation, what's happening is we're colluding with the intellectualization, a defense of thinking that if we just know enough, then we'll be different. But that's not how change works. Intellectualization is a way in which to defend against emotional vulnerability and intimacy and the closeness of contact of what's happening inside of us. So I'm always looking for what's underneath the language. I'm listening for what the person may be conveying with that language, but also what they may be covering up with that language. I really listen to when a specific word gets brought up time and time and time again. What is that connection with? What is that word? My clients will say words to me that sometimes they feel like it's just like a common word that I should just know what that means, like depression. Of course I should know what depression is, right? Like I should have studied a DSM. But when a client brings to me and says, I'm feeling really depressed, often if we don't have a shared understanding of what that word means yet, I'll ask, what is depressed, right? Like what does depression mean to you? And what we find is that every individual has different ideas of what that means. Some people use depression to mean any type of sadness, right? Just like the I feel fat, I feel depressed is just one word that covers all different forms of sadness, despondency, despair, hopelessness, etc. For some people, depression means a very specific thing. For some people, they were handed that word from their family. I've always been told that I'm depressed. And so that's just like what they use now to describe themselves. But it may not actually be accurate to their internal experience. They may have just found that having an emotional life in their family was really rejected. They were the sensitive ones, right? So let's see. So I'm listening for what my client's language is bringing, and also what's it covering up. When we're saying something, what are we denying? What are we ignoring? Why is it that it's always talked about this in this way and not this way? This is what I mean also when I say like, listening is an art form, because I'm not just listening for the words, I'm listening for the meaning of the words, what's not being brought up. I'm listening to how often a word is being brought up. I'm listening to what topics aren't being explored versus are being explored. There's a lot that I'm listening for and listening to that allows this work to be really robust and really meaningful. But of course, like all language, we're trying to convey meaning. And sometimes there's a way in which we hope that, like I said before, we can just bypass the defining of that meaning of that word because we're hoping that the other person can just know us. We're hoping that we don't have to explain ourselves, or that we can just do a PowerPoint presentation to our therapist about the past 20 years of our lives so that we don't have to then go into details about them. As if psychotherapy is just about knowing people, their experiences. But actually the way that we talk about our experiences, what emotions get brought up, that is much more meaningful than just having a book of someone's past 20 years. Yeah. And so the process of bringing language to our experience may also highlight that we are different people, because how I define that word isn't how you define that word. And so when you say, I feel triggered, and I say, what does that mean to you? You may now have this experience of, oh, Thaís and I may be different, right? She may not know what triggered means to me. And that can feel sometimes really spacious. Sometimes that can feel really painful, because we really want the other person to just know us. And something that I like to think about and I like to share is that, like, when we talk about something, when we explain our experiences to somebody who hasn't heard it before, right? When you elucidate or bring words to definitions of words that you just kind of commonly use, you're going to start to find new ways of telling your story. You're gonna find different words for what's happening inside of you. And that will allow you to process your internal experience in a deeper way. So the language that we use really, really matters. And psychotherapy, talk therapy, is really focused on that. But I have to say, when people say, like, what happens in psychotherapy, I often answer, it really depends on who you ask. You not only will get difference in the different therapists, but you may also get a difference in how people understand how to approach the work. For example, the difference between CBT and somatic. If you go to a CBT therapist and you ask them what happens in psychotherapy, they may say psychoeducation is a large part of this work, and workbooks and homeworks and accountability and helping you reframe your thoughts. That's going to be the bulk of the work that you're going to do in CBT. Whereas that's very different in a somatic-based approach, where the emphasis is not going to be so much on psychoeducation, but more psychoeducation in terms of, like, understanding the body and how the nervous system may function. But somatic therapy is really about helping you kind of connect to your physical body as well as your emotional body, right? Like how the body experiences certain things. And all of that is very different than psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which is really what you say when people say talk therapy. That's really what they're referring to, which is the psychotherapy approach of really trying to understand ourselves through language and through the relationship with the psychotherapist. So sometimes it can be easier to break the field of psychotherapy down into kind of two different categories. You have more the skills-based psychotherapists, who you're going to see doing a lot more education and teaching, breathing exercises, mindfulness exercises, kind of more of that category. And then there's the psychotherapists that see themselves more as like developmental psychology, where it's really about helping the individual kind of recalibrate with the ways in which they developmentally didn't get something really important, and now they're finding themselves playing it out in their adult relationships. It's a totally different process. A lot of therapists do both. This is a whole very vast topic that I explore more deeply in my series on my podcast called Talk Therapy, How to Get the Help That You Need. You can go check out the series. I'll put the link in the show notes as well. I really break down like different forms of psychotherapy, blah, blah, blah. But when you break it down into skills-based versus development-based, I'm really almost always speaking to a more development-based psychotherapy. And in that, what I mean when I say what happens in psychotherapy is that we learn to bring more of ourselves into a relationship with another, so we can deepen our knowledge and insight and awareness of ourselves and our emotional landscape, so it stops taking over our lives, so we feel more freedom to make more decisions, so we feel a little bit more kind of in control of ourselves and our lives. But really, it's not necessarily about control in as much as it's about an intimacy with ourselves. The more that we know ourselves, the more that we can trust ourselves, the more spacious we may feel, more free we may be. So it's not necessarily about becoming better, and it's not about often this fantasy that we have of what healing looks like when we're healed we will never feel envy and we'll never feel hatred. It's not that. Psychotherapy is really about learning to be more of who we are and learning to be who we were meant to be. And so the consequence of that is that we may be more tolerant, we may feel more spacious towards other people, but the goal isn't to become a better person per se. It does tend to be a natural consequence, but it's not the goal. I'm not here to be a morally superior other judging you for your decisions and your mistakes. I'm here as a psychotherapist to really accompany you on the exploration of what does it mean to be me in this world, and all of the consequences and challenges that being human means, because a lot of the human experience is hard. There's a lot that we struggle with. The world is hard. There's systemic oppression, there's inequities, there's poverty, there's all sorts of really climate change, there's all sorts of really challenging things in the world. And then there's a lot of challenging things that happen inside of us. And psychotherapy, the art of healing, is an opportunity to expand what we can hold and understand of ourselves, so we're not painfully living out of our awareness. Very, 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 very little psychotherapy is about any form of psychoeducation. And it's certainly not about just being lectured on how to think and how to feel. As for our relationships, if we find ourselves relating in our relationships with words that are filled with jargon, we tend to see this a lot on TikTok when we get examples of how to say things to people. Now, I do this on my Instagram as well, where I give examples of how to say things to people. The reason why I do this is because, like I said, language is important, but I want to be clear that the more emotionally available we are, the less jargon's words we're going to use. So when we're looking at TikTok and we see these therapists and life coaches kind of give examples of how to have conversations with their friends or with colleagues, you'll find that a lot of it is often very filled with jargon. I can no longer hold space for you, for example. Like, what does that even mean? I use the words holding space a lot because I love it. But like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to hold space for another person? The more simple way of saying that is like, I don't know what's happening here, but I often feel very overwhelmed when after we hang out, and I don't know why. I think you're going through a really hard time and you're bringing a lot of things to me, wanting support, and I'm just struggling to know how to support you, because then I feel like I'm a therapist and I just don't know what's going on. Can we talk about it? One is certainly much more honest, it's much more real than saying, I have spoken to my therapist and have decided to develop the boundary where I no longer am available to hold space for you. You're right. Like, those are two very different conversations. One is a conclusion that we're kind of just delivering to the other person, and the other is an in-process communication and exploration. And I tend to find that it's more of these in transition, making sense of things together, where intimacy is born. When we speak to our relationships and find ourselves navigating conflict in our relationships as just like packaging a thing and then delivering it to the person, we're really missing out on a lot more context and nuance that may be happening relationally. I often find that if I think a lot about something and then deliver it in that perfect package, then I'm missing the opportunity to really know the other person's side and also know what I may have missed. That's not to say that sometimes it's not warranted and helpful to really think about something and then bring it to somebody. I'm just saying, if we're bringing it as like this perfectly packaged thing, we're really missing out on an opportunity. But of course, context matters. What relationship I'm talking to or referring to matters, right? Some relationships, that's just you've given it a lot of chances. It's time to deliver the package, right? And sometimes, most of the times, we could really benefit from being more in process with somebody. So notice what language you use, and notice, is this language going to be an opportunity to bring us closer together? Or is this a way that I'm distancing myself from my own feelings that are arising because of this relationship? Because remember, when we're distancing ourselves, when we're using distancing language, we're not just distancing ourselves from the other, we're distancing ourselves from ourselves. So we want to be cognizant of that and be curious about what may we be distancing ourselves from? What may we be pushing away in ourselves that is resulting us in using more jargon-filled language. I challenge you to eliminate these words from your vocabulary and see what comes up. You know, if you'd like an exercise, speaking of skills-based, if you'd like an exercise, jot down all of the words that you find yourself using a lot, like triggered, like boundaries, like trauma dumping, gaslighting, and challenge yourself. See what happens if you remove that language. This is in some ways a fun little homework. that may be bypassing something, which is the exploration of why you're using that word at that specific time. What may you be distancing yourself from in that moment? However, I kind of like it. Play with it. See how it feels. See how you do. Another, like a question that I sometimes ask myself when I'm using jargon language is like, am I offering a presentation? Am I presenting? Or am I trying to connect? And if other people are using big words, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've decided to have this boundary with you where I'm no longer available to hold space, whatever, then ask them, hey, I understand that clearly you've thought a lot about this, and clearly this has brought up a lot. Is there an opening here for us to have a conversation about this? Because there's some words that you're using that I'm just not clear on what those words mean to you. Like, what does boundary mean to you? What does that mean? What did I violate a boundary? Is that why you're feeling like you have to clearly state the boundary? How may I have been broken? This is all kind of how we can get to know each other on a more deeper level. Yes? Okay, I think that's it for this episode. May we find ways to expand our capacity for emotional intimacy, to be really honest with ourselves and the people around us. Because what we tend to find is that when we're more open with ourselves to the world, we tend to know ourselves more deeply, and we tend to feel a little bit more open with ourselves in the world. Am I making sense there? I think when we develop the capacity, when we learn to be more available to ourselves and other people, beautiful things happen in relationships. I'm noticing myself using jargon language here today, trying to get beyond it. It can be hard. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here for all of you. I hope that this was useful for you. Thanks for listening. As always, I really appreciate it. If you're watching here on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe to my channel. If you're listening on a podcast medium, hi, hello, goodbye. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week, and I will catch you in the next episode.